and talk about prices now. We've got the functions of prices in the syllabus. We've already hinted at the subject here and gotten into it a little bit in the second hour. Here you have, again, an illustration. Again, I have to emphasize, we don't know the shapes of these curves. We don't know where they intersect. We do know they intersect, but we don't know where. We don't know the exact shape of the curves. This is just an illustration. Now, the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded intersects at a certain point at a certain price. This is the equilibrium point. That is the point at which quantity supplied and quantity demanded are equal. And it's this price over here, roughly $20 on this graph, at which those things are equal. This is what a market price does. It clears the market. A market price is the price at which every willing buyer finds a willing seller, and every willing seller finds a willing buyer. The market is cleared. That is, there isn't any surplus. There's no shortage. The quantities are equal. Now, when producers and consumers, and again, we've mentioned this before, but I want to emphasize it again. When producers and consumers produce and consume, they watch the market prices. They watch the market prices as signals. Those prices are signals that convey information to them, if they're producers, as to whether they should produce more or less. If they're consumers, whether they should consume more or less. That's a signal. It indicates to everybody in the marketplace what he should do if he wants to maximize his self-interest, if he wants to maximize his well-being. If the price begins to move up, the producer will want to produce more, the consumer will want to consume less. And those opposite wants, those opposite desires, those opposite decisions will result in a new market price, a new equilibrium price being formed somewhere on the graph. There will be a new equilibrium. It's important to understand that prices, one of the important functions of a market price is to convey this information to everybody in the market. You may see, if you're in business, you may see the prices for certain things moving up. You don't have to even know why they're moving up. You don't have to know that the price of plywood is going up because some disaster has struck the Northwest. Or you don't have to know the price of plywood is going up because there's been a hurricane in Florida, whatever. All you have to know is that price is changing. And then you respond to it as a businessman or as a consumer as that price changes. Perhaps you're getting ready to buy plywood here in Washington. At the same time, a hurricane hits the southeast U.S., and it increases the supply. It increases the price of plywood up here. Well, you say, well, maybe I should delay beginning the house for another 3 months until the prices come down again. I can save $2,000 or whatever if I do that. And that may be enough incentive for you to delay beginning construction of your house because of that price movement in plywood or lumber. We make decisions like this all the time, particularly homemakers who go into the market all the time. Maybe we'll delay buying something because the price has moved up. And we'll just wait for it to change. Perhaps it will come down next month. Or maybe we will buy it now because it is down already, and we anticipate that it will move up again. And the market price signals to producers and consumers what they should do. Should they expand production or contract? Should they expand consumption or contract it? By doing that, the market price coordinates production and consumption. This is getting at what Adam Smith meant by the invisible hand. The market price, because it is the equilibrium price, coordinates supply, quantity supplied, and quantity demanded. There is no central authority in the market that says we're going to need 10 million automobiles this year. No central authority in the market that says that. The producers of automobiles try to anticipate what the consumers of automobiles will want and gauge their production accordingly. And at the end of the model year, if they've gauged wrong and they have a huge supply of automobiles waiting around, you can get a bargain at the end of the model year. But this is the way all production and consumption in the market, in a free society, is directed through the market price for whatever the good is, or whatever the product is. Now, let's suppose that the government or the church, if we're in the Middle Ages, decides that this is terrible, that there really has to be a fixed price. Let's suppose that we decide, let's assume this is the supply and demand for milk. And lately the price of milk has been going up, and we want to protect the poor people. We want to ensure that the children of poor people have adequate amounts of milk at fair prices. And politicians talk about like this all the time. It's straight out of the Middle Ages. But this is the way they talk. They're disciples of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and don't even know it. Okay, we're going to have these fair prices so that the poor children can be protected. Let's change this to 50 cents and this to $1, so we're doing something more sensible with milk here, rather than $25. Okay. Let's say milk has gone up to $3 a gallon, which is unconscionable. The poor people can't afford to buy milk for their children. So we're going to pass a law that says milk will sell for no higher than $1.50 a gallon. We're going to help the poor children this way. Sounds good, doesn't it? Who's against helping poor children? Anybody want to vote against helping poor children? Sounds good. Okay, now what are the effects of a law like this enforcing a just or a fair price for milk? What are the effects here? What happens here? Well, it crosses the supply curve at this point. This $1.50 price crosses the supply curve at this point. This means you're going to have 5 gallons of milk supplied at that price. But it crosses the demand curve at this point, which means you're going to have 12 gallons of milk demanded at that price. Now, what do you call it when you have 5 gallons supplied and 12 gallons demanded? A shortage. A shortage. Rather than having at the market price here of saying $2, you have 9, at which every willing buyer finds a willing seller at 9 gallons. Now you have demand for 12 and supply of 5. We have a shortage of 7 gallons of milk. How does this affect the poor children? They don't get the milk. The proposal that you have made here for a just wage or a fair price, whatever you want to call it, ensures that there's a shortage of milk. No one will produce. Well, 5 people will produce gallons of milk at that price, but no one else. Well, there are several ways the government can go at this point. They can come to their senses and remove the price control, but that hardly ever happens. There are several things they can do. What's that? Yes. There are several things they can do. They can institute a rationing program. And they can say, we're going to ration the supply of milk to ensure that it goes to poor families. So then we'll have a big bureaucracy with a rationing program and ration coupons, and you won't be able to buy milk unless you have a ration coupon and that sort of thing. Now, this didn't happen with milk recently in our history, at least not that I know of, but it did happen with gasoline. And some of you may remember buying gasoline in the 1970s in the U.S. It happened for the first time in 1973 and 1974 and again in 1979. The government had imposed price controls on gasoline, and they set the price below the market price. They set the price, here's the market price up here. And the result was shortages. So maybe you've seen, if you've looked at tapes of old news programs or something of that sort and gone to the library and read what's going on in the U.S. in 1973 and 1974 and again in 79, you'll see pictures of automobiles lined up for blocks waiting in line to buy gasoline. And people would wait in line for hours at times to buy gasoline. And then they instituted the rationing programs. Things of the nature, if your license plate ends in an even number, then you can buy gas on even-numbered days. And it's forbidden for you to buy gas at any other time. It's illegal. Or if your license plate is odd, you can buy on odd-numbered days. And on Sunday, everybody gets to buy gas. That sort of thing. Various ways of controlling supply. Now, it's no longer the marketplace that is trying to coordinate supply and demand. The interference with the marketplace here, by fixing the price, ensures that there will be a shortage. Yes, sir?
Does the government agree that they caused the shortage by doing that?
Oh, no. No, it was the Arabs. It wasn't the government at all. It was the Arabs that caused the shortage. Let me give you a little more history here. The OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, organized, I guess, back in the 60s or even earlier, decided in 1973 that since they were no longer being paid in gold for their dollars, they were holding all these American dollars, which were no longer redeemable in gold, that they were being cheated by the Americans, and they were right. We reneged on our promise to pay gold for the dollars. So they organized a cartel and said, we're going to get together and we're going to have an embargo against the United States and the West, all the industrialized nations of the West. And they did so. They said, we're not shipping oil. And with the result that the supply of oil decreased to the U.S. The amount of imported oil decreased into the U.S. Well, this was raising the price of oil in the U.S. You have demand for oil and the supply decreasing, the price tends to go up. But rather than letting it go up, the government said, we're going to fix it. They didn't fix it at $1.50. It was more like 50 cents or 75 cents. They fixed it at to begin with. And rather than allowing it to go up, they said, we're going to fix the price right here. But they had their scapegoat. It was those awful Arabs that were doing it. And it's not us. It's not our policy of price controls. Now, this may have been believable, and many Americans believed it, in fact, this line that they were giving us. Were it not for a couple of peculiarities, such as this. Japan. Japan was in the same situation. Japan imported almost all of its oil, in fact. We imported half or less than half, and Japan imported almost all of its oil. And they were also targets of the Arab oil embargo in the 1970s. Japan had no lines. They had no shortages. You didn't see cars running around the block in Japan lined up waiting to get to a gas station, and then when you pull up to the pump, there isn't any gas left. None of that. Why not? The embargo was aimed at Japan. Their imported oil supply had disappeared as well. Why no shortages in Japan? They did not interfere with the price for gasoline. They allowed the price to rise to where it cleared the market, and there were no shortages. Gas went up perhaps from 50 cents a gallon to $1.50 a gallon, or $2 a gallon, but there were no shortages. Now, what's one of the side effects of that happening in Japan? When the price rises like that, what do consumers do? They conserve. They conserve. In this country, you have to have campaigns, or we did back in the 70s anyway, to get people to conserve. You were lectured, you heard sermons on conserving gas. If they had simply allowed the market to function, the consumers would have conserved out of their self-interest. There was no need for lectures. There's no need for sermons on conservation. None of that. It's precisely because they had already interfered with the market and developed a shortage that you had to have these lectures on why you shouldn't be doing all this driving and why you've got to have 3 people in your car before you go out to work or whatever, and why you have to carpool and why you have to ride the bus. All of these things would have been taken care of very painlessly if the market had simply been allowed to function. People then would have said, well, now, if gas is going to cost me $2 a gallon, maybe I should take the bus to work. It would be better for me to ride the bus to work. I don't have to listen to a lecture about bus riding or whatever. I'll just make that decision based upon what it will cost me to commute versus what it will cost me to ride the bus or the train or whatever. Japan had no shortages. The U.S. did. The difference was not the embargo imposed by OPEC. The difference was the policy of the U.S. government. And the U.S. government created the gasoline shortages in the 1970s. The energy crisis was entirely brought to you by the policies of the United States government. Today we don't hear about the energy crisis anymore because the price controls that had been imposed in the United States by Richard Nixon, August 15, 1971, were lifted, the last ones were lifted, by Ronald Reagan when he came into office in 1981. And as a result of the lifting of those price controls, the market straightened itself out within a relatively short period of time. They were imposed and kept in force all through the Nixon administration, the Ford administration, and the Carter administration. So you have these recurring shortages, nicknamed the energy crisis, all during the 1970s, solely as a result of the policy of interfering with the laws of supply and demand. Yes, sir?
Go back to the milk channel for a moment and the fact that we have some concerns that pork still will be able to get their milk. If price controls don't work, and we recommend or subsidies price pork in that respect also. Ultimately, where I want to go is how do we get this milk to the pork kids, because they can't afford more than $1.50 a gallon. That would be the initial assumption. If you can't afford more than $1.50 a gallon, how do you deliver milk to the pork kids?
Okay. Well, the first thing I suppose I should say is the government doesn't deliver the milk to the poor kids. If a charitable organization wants to deliver the milk to the poor kids, then they open up a store or a soup kitchen or whatever. They buy the milk at the market price, make up the difference between the $1.50 and the market price with their donations, and sell it to the poor people at $1.50 if they wish to do that. Or they could give it to them, for that matter. But in that fashion, there would be no interference with the price mechanism, and the poor people would be getting their milk at a subsidized price. You follow the earnings of the company. If you're considering an investment in a particular company, the financial advisors will tell you to look at a ratio called the price-earnings ratio, the price of the stock as compared to the earnings that the company is making. And that way you can decide whether it's a good investment or not. I saw several others. Yes, sir?
Well, going back to that milk thing, I mean, I function on this basis with my family, which means that if I had budgeted $1.50 per week, I now will stretch that $1.50 for 2 weeks. My family will still get milk, but it will be less milk, it will be more conservative. But if there's no milk out there to buy, it doesn't matter how much of a budget, I'm not going to get milk.
That's right. That's right. And obviously you have a shortfall here. You have a shortage. And many people experience that very thing. They said, well, maybe we'll spend less on gasoline, and then they get in line, they get in queue there to buy gasoline, and they get up to the pump and there's no gasoline. I worked for a member of Congress during the first gasoline shortage, and we were in Washington at the time, and I was the low man on the totem pole. So I had the privilege on a couple of occasions of taking his car out for gas. And he knew it would be just a waste of time. He wasn't going to do it. So I would take his big Oldsmobile or whatever it was, some gas-guzzling car, and I would go sit at the gas station for up to 2 hours. He had no special privileges because he was a congressman. He was a Republican at that time, and Republicans didn't have any special privileges. And we sat, or I sat, in his car at the gas station for a couple hours, waiting to buy gas. And then you get 10 gallons or whatever, if they have gas, if they have any. Sometimes they didn't have any at all. And you used to pull into gas stations and they'd say, sorry, no gas. Or those of you who are older as I am recall the days when there was no such thing as a self-service station. Self-service came out of the gas shortages of the 1970s. Before 1973, you pulled into a gas station, an attendant came out, said, fill her up. Can I check your battery? Can I check your oil? Can I wash your windshield? Can I check your tires? And all of that was done for the price of the gallon of gas, which was about 30 cents a gallon before 1973. Nowadays, of course, you can still get that. Most gas stations will add a surcharge on, maybe 10 cents a gallon, if you want what they call full service. But there were no self-service gas stations. That was one of the ways in which the stations responded to the cost of providing gasoline to their customers and to the fact that gasoline is in such short supply that we don't have to be nice anymore to these customers. Now, it's very, very common to go into a gas station and get some sort of gift. You get a drinking glass when you fill up, that sort of thing. Very common to do that. All kinds of things. You can work on your sterling silver collection by buying gas or whatever. That all ended with the shortages in the 1970s. Well, there's another possibility here. Let's assume that the price of, and I'll go back to milk because this is an example from the state of Pennsylvania. It's not nationwide. But let's assume that the price of milk falls to $1.50 a gallon, and this time we want to help not the poor consumers, but the poor farmers. And of course, there are congressmen that are always talking about the poor farmers. So now we're going to have fix the price here at, say, $2.50 a gallon for a gallon of milk, $2.50 a gallon, to help the poor farmers. After all, the farmer is the backbone of the country. If the farmer goes under, we all go under. The family farms are disappearing. You've heard all the stories. So we've got to help these poor farmers. They're the future of America. So now we fix the price at $2.50 a gallon for a gallon of milk. Now it intersects these curves at these places. Rather than a market-clearing price here of $2 a gallon, in which every willing farmer finds a willing buyer of milk, we now have two different intersections here on these curves. And it looks like this one sort of falls at the 6 as far as the quantity demanded, and this one sort of falls at 11 at the quantity supplied. Now what do you have? When the government fixes a price above the market price in order to help the producers, you've got a surplus. You got 11 here and 6. You got a surplus of 5 units of milk, 5 gallons of milk. What do you do now? Make cheese. What did the government do with it? Made cheese, ship it overseas, made butter, put it in stockpiles, anything to keep the price up here. In the state of Pennsylvania, the state actually passed a law like this, raising the price, and no one was permitted to sell milk for less than, I've forgotten what the price was, we'll assume it's $2.50 a gallon. And the farmers, lo and behold, didn't like it because they were selling less milk. The government wasn't buying up the surplus, as the federal government does with the surplus. The government is not buying the surplus in Pennsylvania. The farmers are making less money than they did before, selling at a lower price. So they're trying to think of ways that they can eliminate this law. And they hired a sharp lawyer. And the lawyer read the law very carefully. And he found exactly what he was looking for. It said that milk sold for human consumption in the state of Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, cannot be sold for less than $2.50 a gallon. And what he saw, and his eyes lit up when he saw it, was that word human, for human consumption. This is the great loophole. So the farmers started labeling it pet milk. Milk for your cats, milk for your dogs. And they shipped it out and sold it in the supermarkets as pet food. Pasteurized, homogenized, vitamin D added, pet milk. Everybody knew what the joke was. And people started buying the pet milk at the market price. And it wasn't long before the legislators in Pennsylvania actually caught on and repealed the law. But it was, they had used the word human, so we're going to sell it as pet milk. And people bought their pet milk. But here you have two of the effects of interfering with the market price are shortages and supplies. If you fix a fair price below market, you get a shortage. If you fix one above market, you get a surplus. And then there are all sorts of secondary consequences. Yes, sir?
That might be stupid, but obviously they've seen gas problem and prices, so why would they think something like that would work?
Well, see, with the gasoline, they were convinced, or they convinced themselves anyway, that it wasn't their policy, it was the Arabs. And they always find a scapegoat for what these policies do. And
they're saying that it doesn't work. Something happened that made it not work the way it's supposed to. This is actually supposed to work. And
yeah.
Wrong.
Yeah. And frequently, some theorists will even say such things as, well, this would work if men were not criminals, or if men were not sinners, this sort of thing would work. Well, this has nothing to do with sin. This has nothing to do with sin. Everyone acts in his own self-interest. It's not a matter of sin or virtue or whatever. It has nothing to do with sin. Because we're rational creatures, people choose, and people choose things that they think are going to benefit them. And because they choose that way, you have the laws of supply and demand. These follow inexorably from the idea of choice and self-interest. And the government isn't going to change it. By interfering with the price, by interfering with the market, coordinating supply and demand, they end up with shortages and surpluses. Now, we've already mentioned some of the secondary consequences. Rather than changing the market or the fixed price, which is set below market, rather than eliminating it, they will impose rationing. And I don't see anyone in the room that lived through World War II rationing. But can you tell us anything about it, sir?
The gasoline, aid card, you got the most gas, government employees, or that type of thing. Mm-hmm. And we had a seat card, which was the lowest amount of gas.
Uh-huh.
And my dad worked about a mile and a half from home, and slightly downhill. So his coat for work, and he was dry at home. And just things like that. Yep. Sugar was the same way. You had little tickets to buy sugar or shoes or Levi's. You could only buy one pair of Levi's a year, I think. Mm-hmm. And I was about 12 years old.
Yeah. Well, there you have the complete rationing, not just gasoline, but applied to practically everything, as I understand it, during World War II. Everything that they thought was necessary to the war effort, in any case. And you couldn't buy because of the shortages created by the controls. They had to, or they came up, they didn't have to, but they came up with a rationing coupon system, and then they gave them out. And as you heard, they had different classes. One class for the more necessary people, whoever they might be, a government employee. A second class for less necessary people, and a third class for those unworthy of living. And that's what happens in a rationing system. It becomes a system of favoritism. And it has further consequences as well. One of the effects of having a surplus is now you get to figure out what to do with the surplus. At the federal level, they buy it up. The federal government actually buys the surplus from the farmers. And in the case of milk, they turn it into butter, they turn it into cheese, they ship it overseas, they buy the grain from the wheat farmers, they put it in ships, they ship it to India and feed the rats. That sort of thing, through the foreign aid program. And it happens all the time. But there are all these secondary consequences. You have all the taxes, all the bureaucracy that you need for running rationing programs, all sorts of difficulties like that. And it could all be taken care of very easily if the government simply allowed the market to function and allowed consumers and producers to arrive at their own agreements as to what they're going to pay for things and how much they're going to consume and produce. Yes, ma'am?
During the war with was the idea that they wouldn't have these things for the war production if they didn't do the rationing, or were they trying to keep the price down, or what?
Both. That was the argument, and it frequently is that we're in an emergency situation, and under the War Powers Act, we're going to impose rationing, we're going to impose price controls, that sort of thing, because otherwise we will not be able to get the material we need, the gasoline. We need the gasoline or the oil for the tanks, so we can't have you guys driving around in your automobiles. And that was the rationale used for it. That's the same rationale that's used for drafting people, and of course 10 million men were drafted in World War II. That's how Franklin Roosevelt solved the unemployment problem. You draft 10 million men, and you begin doing it in 1940 in peacetime. Again, if the government had been willing to pay for the war in the sense that they wanted to pay the market price for the gasoline or the sugar, whatever it was, that would have been available. And I'm sure many Americans would have been patriotic enough to sell it to the government at low prices. But rather than doing that, they imposed the comprehensive system of controls and rationing. And it wasn't until after the war that some of those controls were lifted, and some of them were never lifted, for that matter. But the war was used as the excuse for doing that. The wars are frequently used for increasing government control over family life and the market and society in general. There's no reason, there's no necessity for doing that, but frequently that's what happened. It's a politically opportune time to increase your power if you're a politician. You can appeal to patriotism, and anybody who disagrees with you can be regarded as a traitor or someone who is subversive. So it's a good time for politicians who want to increase their power. But again, if the market were allowed to function, it would function better than any rationing or price control system. It's ironic, in waging a war against Nazism and fascism, we adopted the policies at home of the Nazis and the fascists, save for the execution of Jews. We just incarcerated Japanese. But we adopted the economic policies of the Nazis and the fascists in the U.S. during World War II. Any other questions? Tony?
What you've given us is the law of supply and demand, the free market theory. We've got as far as the biblical basis for it. We've seen the groundwork laid in terms of men acting in their own self-interest. Is there anything beyond that as far as making the case for this is the way it ought to be?
There are many specific illustrations in Scripture. One gentleman just reminded me of one during the break. Let's turn to Matthew 20. Matthew chapter 20, and I'll read from the New International Version. The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire men to work in his vineyard. Now we're talking about the labor market here. But a wage is a price. Wages are prices. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. About the third hour he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. That is 3 hours later. He already has a group of workers working, and then 3 hours later he goes out and hires some more. He went out again about the 6th hour, 3 hours later, and the 9th hour, and did the same thing. About the 11th hour, he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?" "Because no one has hired us," they answered. He said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first." The workers who were hired about the 11th hour came, and each received a denarius. So when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "These men who were hired last worked only 1 hour," they said, "and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day." But he answered one of them, "Friend, I am not being unfair to you. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the man who was hired last the same as you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous?" There you have a free market in labor. And the employer reaches an agreement with the workers. Yet the workers who are hired first are resentful. They're envious of the generosity of the employer because he pays the people that worked 1 hour the same as he pays them who worked all day long. And the response of Christ is here, "I am not being unfair to you. I am not being unfair to you." People think this is unfair. Some just bristle at the idea. Christ says, "I'm not being unfair. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? We had our agreement. That was our agreement. I didn't twist your arm. You didn't twist my arm. The government didn't dictate this wage. Caesar had nothing to do with it. We arrived at this agreement by mutual consent. I'll pay you a denarius if you work in my vineyard. You agreed to do it, and now you want to renege on your agreement." They want more now. He says, "I want to give the man who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money?" And there are many similar passages in the parables, especially, of Christ. One can think of the parable of the talents, where the master parcels out different talents to different stewards, to different workers. One gets 5, one gets 2, one gets 1. And the steward who receives the 5 talents invests it and doubles his money. And when the master returns, he says, "Look, I've earned you 5 more." And he's praised for doing that. The master praises him. And then the one who received 2 talents doubles his money. And when the master returns, he's praised. He says, "Well done, good and faithful servant." But the fellow who received the 1 talent, he says, "Knowing you were a hard man and drive a hard bargain," he says, "I went out and I buried that talent and I kept it safe, and here it is back to you."